Welcome to University Drive, your pathway to the transformational work of University of the Bahamas. Our goal is to build a better Bahamas by shaping tomorrow's leaders today, finding solutions to challenges, and forging new opportunities for growth. University Drive, where faculty, staff, students, and alumni travel the road of progress together with you.
A strong middle class is crucial for economic stability, social cohesion, and overall prosperity. It drives consumer spending, fosters innovation, and supports a healthy democracy by promoting equality of opportunity and reducing societal tensions. Additionally, a robust middle class helps reduce poverty levels and provides a buffer against economic downturns. Welcome to University Drive. I'm your host, Nikki Bowe, and today's show will focus on estimating the cost of middle-class life in the Bahamas. My guest today is Lesvie Archer, Policy Fellow at the Government and Public Policy Institute here at University of the Bahamas. And we are going to be talking about a recent research conducted by Ms. Archer on estimating the cost of middle-class life in the Bahamas. You may know her from the Living Wage Study. And of course, we're always talking about wages, minimum wage, wage increase. And I'm guaranteeing you that this conversation is going to be very, very interesting. Ms. Archer, thank you so much for being my guest today on University Drive.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be in your company.
So before we dive into this, what prompted you to conduct research on estimating the cost of middle-class life in the Bahamas?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, a few years ago, the Government and Public Policy Institute released a study on living wages in the Bahamas. So we estimated the cost of a basic but decent life on New Providence and Grand Bahama. That's it. And from there, like you mentioned also in an introduction, we also have the middle class, which usually represents the largest part of a community in some sectors. So it just partially out of curiosity, we wanted to figure out, or I wanted to figure out, well, okay, what is a basic but decent cost of middle class life in the Bahamas? So that is what prompted me to do the research. And also because there isn't any empirical information. You have international websites, you have some media reports, but in terms of an empirical study, an academic study, that's, in short supply. And so I saw a need and a gap and decided to release the study.
Okay, I'm looking forward to what this says. So I'm just going to read a brief synopsis. It says, while a country's middle class typically indicates its overall economic well-being, little research exists on the financial challenges of living middle class in the Bahamas. This study estimates the cost of middle class in the Bahamas. It operates as an extension of the Bahamas Living Wages Study in 2021 because it embraces the Anchor and Anchor Living Wages methodology to estimate the cost of maintaining a decent standard of living on two islands. Findings reveal that sustaining a middle-class lifestyle for a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children costs around $9,100 per month in New Providence and $8,050 per month in Grand Bahama. These findings offer useful insights into quality of life debates and policies related to the cost of living on different islands in the Bahamas. Now, let's get into this because this $9,100 per month for a family of 4. So, Leslie, when we talk about middle class, what constitutes a middle class? What is the definition of middle class? Because I know there are varying definitions, but based on your research, how did you frame and structure or factor in which category of people fit into that definition of middle class?
Okay, that's a great question. That was one of the biggest challenges I was faced with, determining or constructing what would represent my middle class community. So I went first of all to I went to find out in literature the government released a wages survey that had the average wages for different professions, but the last release of that survey was in 2001, which made that survey 22 years old. So I knew that the numbers, the wages on that would not be relevant. But when I had a closer look at the survey, I found that the professions were still relevant for middle class persons. For example, the persons that they considered in the middle income brackets were considered healthcare professionals, teaching professionals, business professionals. Though that category of persons, I said, okay, well, yeah, this is our middle class today still. So I started with that, determining the middle wage by profession. So these represent the professional community in our nation. From there, I like to find out prices of transportation. I called the car companies. I said, "Hi, I'm a researcher, and I want to know when persons come in to your company to buy a car, and they usually, you know, that they're in this profession. They're a healthcare professional, or they work in sales and marketing. They're a sales and marketing executive. What type of car do you usually purchase?" And then they would give me the response, like they'd give me two or three types of car. But they say, oh, okay, well, if this person comes in, more than likely they're either going to get one of these two cars. That's more than likely. Or if they're coming from this profession, this type of car. So I'd be like, okay, great. Can you send me this information with all of the total costs, you know, VAT and everything? So I had to navigate it like that to construct a profile, I guess, of a middle income person. You know, they're more likely to send their children to private schools. So I got the school fees of several private schools in the country, um, to get an average weight estimate of how much it costs to educate your children in the private school community. Also, healthcare. You know, more than likely to have private insurance. So I called, got estimates for insurance, and so that kind of research, I guess, heavy in the fieldwork side, is what I did in order to gain access to understanding what the cost would be.
That is
Yes.
quite a bit of research, and very clever tactics in order to construct that profile that you spoke of, and looking at it by professions, given the fact that, the previous data was so old and you wanted your data to reflect a more recent and relevant economic climate for today, I suppose is the best term. Um, so take us through the findings. What were some of the most startling things that you stumbled upon or discovered? I don't want to say stumbled upon because you were intentionally researching, that you discovered as a result of this research.
Okay. So I would say one of I don't know if anything really shocked me because I'm also middle class.
I got you. So let's go through the findings then, for the sake of our listeners, and then we could unravel the conversation around that. What were the
Okay.
findings of your research, Lesvie?
Okay, so let's go to food first. So first of all, the I say that the study is based on the living wages study because I used the anchor methodology. The anchor methodology argues that living wages is a family concept. So I didn't construct following that. I didn't construct a middle class income for one person. I looked at a family. So the same thing, the family of four, two working parents and two children. So everything is done within that perspective. So for example, with the food, I also use the same cost of food, the same meal plan from the living wages study that was done in 2021. This plan was actually constructed by a local nutritionist. It's 2,100 calories, super affordable, tuna and grits for breakfast. You have fish, mashed potato, and veggies for lunch, and peas and rice, snapper with a salad for dinner, with two snacks in between, peanuts, banana. It's a really healthy meal, but it's affordable and it's palatable for local consumption. So local people enjoy it, right? So I took that same meal plan, but instead of going to the lower income food store areas, I used the fieldwork areas that are more on the outskirts of New Providence, right? And so I went to those stores and I got the prices um, from there because there's a difference. When I in Grand Bahama, because this is post-Orient, the same, I had to work with the same area of the island that is more active. So I went to the same stores in those areas to understand pricing. And what I found there was, and this is if you buy, it costs about $12 a day. And that's if you're buying bulk food. $12 a day per person to have the three meals. If you the tuna and grits. So I know that sounds like people like no, that's not true. But if you're buying in bulk and if you're buying from certain areas, both on Grand Bahama and in New Providence, it was around $12 a day. And so that totals around $1,400 a month. So the question is, are you spending around, well, $1,400 a month for groceries? And this doesn't include meals eaten out. So it doesn't include giving your kids lunch money or stopping the KFC or Burger King here or there. Um, Grocery buying in bulk, $1,400 a month. That is what the research showed. So we started out with both in Grand Bahama and New Providence. After that, we had to figure according to the methodology, housing. Where do persons in these type of professions, where do they tend to live? For the living wages study, I found some really affordable homes in Mason's Additions, and in some parts of Bain and Grantstown for like $400 a month for a two-bedroom house. But the middle class probably does not want to or will not likely consider those areas their first preference. So I had to go to for West Bay Street in Stapleton area, Little Blair, places out east, but still on the outskirts. I went on real estate websites. I spoke with real estate agents. I asked around. I got about 50 estimates of rentals that were available at that time. And the lowest average I could come up with was around $2,000. So let's say if you're paying 1,500 for two-bedroom, an additional 500 for expenses in New Providence, right? And in Grand Bahama, it was around $1,600 in the Lucaya community. So we are at 1,400 for food, and then 2,000 for housing a month. So we're at 3,400 right now if we're in New Providence, and we're around 3,000 if we're on Grand Bahama. You agree so far?
Yep, these numbers sounding good.
And so after that, we had to do, according to the methodology, the non-food, non-housing costs. So this basically is everything else, all of the other expenditures from um, transportation, communication, furnishings, equipment, education, miscellaneous, eating out, recreation and culture, clothing and footwear, alcohol, and health. Now, this list of expenditures that I just shared, it's not a list I constructed. It's a list that's on the housing expenditure survey that the government of the Bahamas generates. Actually, housing expenditure surveys are generated in countries all over the world to give an idea of consumption patterns. When I say consumption patterns, I mean the average amount that persons spend is recorded by the government, and they can determine sections. Like it's called 10 deciles. Persons in decile 1 and 2, their spending habits would represent those of, let's say, the illegal immigrant community or those who live, Bahamians who live at the poverty line. That would be decile 1 and 2, how much they spend a day. Decile 3 is where I put the living wage study, persons who are making minimum wage, how much they spend on average. So they may spend, for example, 10% on food, 40% on transportation. I hope that makes sense how I'm explaining it. So people at decile 10, they may spend only 20% on transportation and 15% on food. So for the middle class, I chose decile 6 because it's kind of in the middle. So according to the expenditure survey, I hope I'm explaining this as simply as
Yes,
possible.
I'm following. So this is in
Okay,
layman's
great.
terms. Yep.
So according to the latest expenditure survey, it says that persons who are in decile 6, on average, they spend about 16% of their income on food and about 42.8% of their income on housing, 14% on transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And what I did, I had to come up with figures for that. But the living wage methodology, again, I stuck to a methodology. It stated that basic but decent. So I took out eating out, and I said, well, this family of four does meal planning. They buy in bulk and they eat at home. Everybody packs their food. Now, that is controversial because I'm not sure how much that reflects the reality of our middle class. So I am thinking about that. But for now, we're going to go with it that this quote actually does not include the 9100. It doesn't include eating out. So if you actually, and if you are a middle class family of four and you actually don't eat out, it's going to be way above the 9,100. I think it's like $1,000 difference actually. So I had to calculate those figures, and that's secondary research. So I didn't go and find out, how much a new outfit costs. I used the statistical information that was presented by the government, and I inputted the figures and did the calculations to generate some answers. And however, middle class life is signified in three areas. Actually, cost of living between the different classes, there are three basic components of the non-food, non-housing aspect that really would be class specific. And that would be how you get where you need to get your transportation. So middle class likely to use a different style of transportation from lower income persons. Education, where you decide to educate your children. And the third area where you can tell a difference if you're middle class or lower income would be transportation, education, and healthcare, right? If you have private healthcare or not. So those figures, I went and I had to do additional research to get estimates. And just something interesting, because it's just good to put things in perspective. For example, I surveyed 3 schools in New Providence, middle income schools, typical religious denomination schools that are popular here in Nassau. And it costs to educate 2 children from kindergarten straight through 12th grade. It's a between 104 or $104,000 to $155,000. So that's how much it costs to educate 2 children in public school from kindergarten to grade 12. And this is not including inflation, of course. And then, school fees goes up,
You
I think,
made
every
an
2
error.
or
You
3
said
years.
in public schools, but you meant private schools.
Yes, sorry, private schools. So, and the situation is that the research will show that middle income families, once their family has elevated to a middle income life, it's very difficult for children to go back on that. So, for example, if my mother went to private school and it cost her parents maybe $15 a month, I want to send now as her daughter, she wants to send me to private school, but it will cost her $1,500, or it may cost her $150. And that's a bigger part of her salary. But now me, I may want to continue that. I don't want my children in government school. I want to keep that legacy. I want my children to be in the same house, for example, etc. The schoolhouse that I mean, competing. So now I want to send my children to private school, but it's costing me now much more of my salary than it cost my mother to put me through school, or much more of my salary than it even costs, of course, my grandmother to put my mother through school. But the middle class will tend to make that sacrifice because they want to maintain the standard of living that their parents before them set. And that is heavy on the finances when you don't have incomes raising to meet cost of living expenses in a country. So yes, for education, and that so it's between 104 to $155,000 a month, depending on what school you go to within the schools that I surveyed. But that breaks down to around $742 a month. So what I'm saying is that if you have 2 kids, both of your kids in private school, you may basic but decent private school, you may be paying around $742 a month to keep your kids in the school. And that's including everything, including, those letters that are sent home. We need a $25 fun day experience, the field trips, the fundraisers, all of that, the seat fees, the $125 seat fees to reserve there. there CETA the following semester. So all of that is included in that 742 on average. You will be paying a month to cover that based upon the research findings. So also healthcare, the middle income community in this country would be more than likely, or excuse me, they would tend to have private healthcare. So I called several insurance companies. I'm a researcher. I just want to go, an average family of four, maybe family in their 30s or 40s, what would be the cost of health insurance for them? And I got estimates and I generated averages from there. And it's around $900 a month for a family of four, but it also includes, co-pays, other visits, things that may come up. That was around the lowest. Well, I wouldn't say the lowest, but the average. So from high to low estimates that I got around the average, about $900 a month for a family of four. Medicines to cover that. And like I said, basic but decent. So after I got those figures, and I didn't say the transportation. I told you I called the car companies. And what I found, I asked them, what type of car would a person, if you have a person who's a healthcare professional and they want to buy a car, how much will it be? Or what type of car would they get? And they said, well, usually this professional, they may get a Camry or this type of car. And I said, well, can you send me an estimate, the cost? In Grand Bahama, they said usually, the Bahamian healthcare would probably buy a Rush or a Creta. So I said, okay, great. Can you send me down the cost and how much this would be? And then I got those prices. I called insurance companies. How much does it cost to insure this car? Registration. I got that. I called to figure out how much it costs to get the car serviced, tires changed, every 40,000 miles, brakes, shock absorbers, all of these expenses that go along with maintaining a vehicle. And it comes down to around $708 a month. Now, let me explain this. It's $708 a month, but this is for the lifespan of a new car, which is 15 years. That includes the cost of the car. So, for example, back in 2022, when I collected this data, a Rush or Creta was around $34,000. So I take that $34,000, add the insurance, the monthly rates, additional fees, which includes the service, job, and how regularly I need to do that, the tires change, shocks, all of that, including the 34,000, divided over 15 years, which is the lifespan of the car, the estimated lifespan, and you get around $708 a month. So obviously, I'm not talking about if you decide to get a loan to buy a car, etc., because you have additional interest payments, etc., that you have to take responsibility for. So this does not consider interest payments or loan payments. This considers that you're making enough money to live, to be able to afford your needs so that you don't have to take out a loan. So doing that, it's around $708 a month in Grand Bahama and around $849 a month in New Providence. We good?
Leslie, yeah, we're good. I'm gonna ask you we're gonna take a break. We've come to our first break here, but when we come back from the break, I want to go through some of these things. And you've been mentioning two words, basic and decent, and I need a definition on those because to me,
Yes.
that is
Yes,
very
yes.
subjective.
I know where you're going.
Right? So we're going to
going.
take our first break here on University Drive. When we come back, we're going to finish up this conversation, but I also want Lesvie to give us the definition on two words she keeps throwing out there, basic and decent. We'll be right back on University Drive. Stay tuned.
The one big draw of doing a doctoral degree here is that you don't have to move and you don't have to take your family to a different place, and so you can do it right here. The same abilities that you would have in UK or with America with being able to research is available here. And we now have all these facilities, and so they can take advantage of it at a much cheaper cost to the individual.
Chapter One Bookstore is proud to serve the students, faculty, and staff of the University of the Bahamas and the community at large. We are the premier choice for the purchase of university textbooks and supplies, and UB logo apparel, paraphernalia, and gifts. We also carry a wide variety of school supplies, learning aids, and leisure books. Visit our copy center for all of your printing, copying, and binding needs. Chapter One Bookstore is located on the ground floor of the Michael H. Eldon Complex on University Drive. Shop with us on Monday through Saturday. You can contact us at 397-2650 or email at chapter1@ub.edu.bs. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Chapter One Bookstore. Chapter One, the premier choice.
My name is Jeannie Gibson. I'm the policy assistant here at the Government and Public Policy Institute. The series that we normally do on a quarterly basis, one of those is Meet the Policymakers series, is to actually engage the policymakers to discuss relevant policies to what's going on relating to those policies here in the country, as well as to give the public an opportunity to hear and actually discuss it with the policymakers.
Welcome to Independence Cafeteria, home of affordable, diverse, and delectable dishes that your taste buds will love. Choose from our everyday menu of baked chicken, wings, or fish fingers, or our extensive salad bar. Build your own pasta, grab something hot from the grill, or ask about our special of the day. Our full team of culinary professionals can't wait to serve you. We're located in Independence Park at University of the Bahamas' Oaksfield campus. Call us at 302-4390. Download the app or order online at www.independencecafeteria.com. Your taste buds will thank you.
Get ready, UB Fit Fun Run Walk Bike Skate Push Race Weekend is coming, April 19th to the 21st. Complete your 5K, 10K, or 15K virtually, or join the big race at the Oaksfield campus on Saturday, April 20th at 6 a.m. Funds raised will support UB's annual fund. Form a team and register at Chapter One Bookstore or online at ubfit.ub.edu.bs. Thanks to our title sponsor, Doctors Hospital Health System. Gold sponsors, Island Luck, Commonwealth Bank, and Fidelity Bank. Bronze sponsors, Shell Western Supply and Trading Limited and BPL. Additional sponsors include Alive Rap, Glano, Deloitte, J.S. Johnson, Family Guardian, BWA, Commonwealth Beauty Limited, Nassau Agency, Campbell Shipping, Bahamas First, Lombard ODA, Nautilus, Wendy's, Popeyes, Marco, Bahamas Hospitals Authority, Thompson Trading, Walk-In Clinic, and Public Workers Cooperative. Join us at UB Fit 2024 as University of the Bahamas celebrates its 50th Golden Jubilee. Register today for UB Fit 2024 Big Race Saturday, April 20th. Phone 424-8887 for more info.
Welcome back to University Drive. If you're just joining us, my guest today is Lesvie Archer, Policy Fellow at the Government and Public Policy Institute here at University of the Bahamas. And today's conversation is focusing on estimating the cost of middle-class life in the Bahamas. Some of you may have heard a previous study done by Lesvie on living wage in the Bahamas, which wasn't minimum wage, but what a living wage looks like. And she did research on New Providence and Grand Bahama. This one focuses on estimating the cost of middle class. And you referenced quite a number of things. The findings from food and housing, which you pegged at $1,400 for food, $2,000 for housing, and then there were some other categories. We were talking about what education looks like for 2 children per month, healthcare, transportation, and how you got to all of these things. 2 words you've been mentioning, basic and decent. And I think those are very subjective. How did you formulate the definition of basic and decent for this particular study?
That's a very good question. The phrase basic and decent came from the living wage methodology. How much does a basic but decent life cost in the Bahamas for lower income workers? And I adopted it in pursuing the middle income cost of living, which, as you said, is highly subjective. So, basic in terms of, as I mentioned, I used the six decile, so that grouping in the middle, and their spending patterns. But decent, I also tried to be culturally sensitive as to what certain trends were happening in the country. For example, with the education, research will show that the middle class, but once their parents have received a standard of life, the children want to continue that. They don't want to go back or regress, even if it costs them 10 times as much. So even if the school fee, maybe for their parents, may have been 10% of their salary, they want to keep their children in that same school or higher school, even if it ends up costing them 30% of their salary. So that's kind of how I tried to, with the decent, I tried to be culturally sensitive as to what is happening, which schools have the majority of persons enrolled. So there is the many Christian private schools. That is where you find a lot of the majority of the children that come from middle class families are enrolled in there. So that's why I used that particular grouping. Also, another subjective point was transportation, wherein the a lot of middle class there's a question raised about why I got the price of new vehicles that middle class persons tend to use instead of used vehicles. And one of the considerations I made is that if you're middle class, why can't you afford a new vehicle? So and then in terms of repairs, etc., and those types of costs that are associated with used vehicles, several are basic and decent. If you're at this middle class family profile that I characterized in the beginning, you should be able to afford a new vehicle. A new vehicle has a lifespan of 15 years, and the monthly price came down to, I think it was around 700 a month, but that includes the cost of the vehicle for the entire 15 years time, the cost of gas, all of the service jobs, repairs, and everything that it would need over the time, and a broad estimate of it. And then when it comes to, that was education, that was transportation, and also basic and decent. There comes the question of health insurance. Why did I choose private? Why did I get quotes for private health insurance instead of just saying that middle class persons have they use the public hospital system? And I did that because middle class tends to privatize their health insurance. They want their children to go to private doctors. And if you can't, the question is, why can't you, as a middle class citizen, afford to take your children to a private physician? Should that be an upper class thing only? So when I put these things in perspective generally, in what it should generally be, or people would consider that it generally is to be and operate as middle class, to be able to have private healthcare coverage, to be able to get a new car and manage it for the 15-year time, to be able to send your children to private school. That is what I crafted out as a basic but decent lifestyle for Bahamians. And of course, it is subjective. So this work out there is just something that's empirically generated. It will be released in the journal in October, and it's something for persons to look at, feed upon. If they want to challenge, contest it, conduct your own research, great. But at the moment, we don't have anything that's empirically driven that I have been able to find with identifying the cost of living besides the living wage. And another point I want to add, I calculated the living wage reflects the cost if you have public health insurance, if you use the bus system, and if your children go to public school. So that research is actually done in the living wage. What is a basic and decent life? The minimum requirement, that was a little over between $4,000 and $5,000 a month for a family of four. So I already had that information. So I went a step up and let me see what is middle class would be like.
Lesvie, before we go any further, I want you to tell our listeners what kind of prompted and inspired you to do this research. You said you got a phone call with people looking for information. So I'm sure people are curious as to why you would have delved into the middle class in this amount of detail?
Okay, so I had this information for a while. I collected it, but I didn't release it publicly. Until I got a phone call one day when I realized, oh, our country, like, there's more value than me just having this information and collecting it. I got a phone call from the U.S. from a um, nonprofit organization looking for help with research. It was a legal situation having to do with a Bahamian family that was implicated. They got caught up, and something happened. Something bad happened to one of the members, and they were trying to figure out compensation for the Bahamian family that was away. And they needed cost of living figures in the country, not just own research, because the legal system in America wasn't just accepting, private consultancy research. They wanted to know, what is there any government available information? Is there any, legitimately publicized information that had been vetted? And we didn't really have any in the country that was recent and up to date. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that I was just holding on to this information, and it actually can help save somebody's life, a family's life, and their well-being in a different country. And so having that kind of wake up shock that, this isn't just a research thing, because I sit at a desk and I do papers, but this actually is connected to saving people's livelihoods in that way, that affected me. So I was like, well, you know what? Let me push, get this information out. Let me get it vetted by the peer review process. And so at least there's something here from the country, and you can take and do whatever you want, but there's a starting point that we have some data or information that can be used, that is considered verifiable, reliable, empirically sound, in terms of cost of living in the Bahamas. And so that's what motivated me to really push this information out there.
Thank you for sharing that. Sorry, you spoke about two categories of your findings, food and housing. And then you came over and you talked about transportation, education, and healthcare. And they fit into the non-food or non-housing category. Food is $1,400, housing is $2,000. Non-food and non-housing, what does that figure equate to, and how would you have arrived at that?
Okay, so the non-food, non-housing costs total $4,500 a month. Now, this was a combination of using secondary data that, and then I went for primary data in those three categories. So this information, following the Anchor and Anchor living wage methodology, I looked at government statistics. The government produces, well, they're supposed to produce on a regular basis a housing expenditure survey. This is a survey that is produced in countries all over the world that shows an average of how much locals spend on certain items in their country. So, for example, it's usually in percentages. It would say communication as a category, and then it would say, depending on, you would either spend, some people spend maybe 3% of their income on communication, some persons spend 10% of their income on communication, some persons may spend 15% of their income on communication. So several categories of this expenditure survey. Like this, I said, this is a standardized international survey, and they have these categories and the percentages. Now, I chose decile 6. There are 10 deciles when you go to the survey document, and all you have to do is Google Bahamas Housing Expenditure Survey, and you will see the latest one. Unfortunately, the latest one came out in 2013, but like I said, I was working with percentages. So persons, and they split up the population of the Bahamas into 10 deciles. Decile 10 would be those who have the highest level of income in the country. Decile 1 and 2 would tend to represent the poor, who have who persons who are operating at the poverty line or below, and maybe the illegal immigrant community. Decile 3 represents what I put as the minimum wage group. And because I use the minimum wage group for decile 3, and I know decile 10 was the represented persons who receive the highest incomes in the country, I said, well, in the middle will kind of be decile 6.
So I looked at the percentages that were in this survey on decile 6, saying how much persons who represent decile 6 spend in these categories. And the categories included transportation, communication, furnishings, housing, and equipment and maintenance, education, miscellaneous, eating out, recreation and culture, clothing and footwear, alcohol, health. So those different categories, I took the percentages and I converted the percentages into actual cost. So because I already researched that it costs about $12 a day per person if they're buying in bulk and not eating out, it would cost a person $12 a day to get 3 meals and 2 snacks. Following this very basic nutrition plan. I know that sounds ridiculous, but following this very basic meal plan that I explained earlier, the tuna and grits, and you buying in bulk. So once I had that $12, I was able to calculate the actual cost of each of the remaining categories that was in the expenditure survey. And then after I calculated it, sometimes it doesn't always add up. Sometimes you do need to go and do primary research, and the methodology encourages you to still go and check out what the actual numbers are in those 3 categories, because the methodology states, and other literature will confirm, that transportation, house not trans, transportation, education, and healthcare some of the most subjective categories when it comes to determining class rankings and income levels. That is where you will find the distinctions between middle class, um, lower income, and upper class the most, with the exception of food and housing, because we're talking about non food, non housing. After food and housing, the next 3 categories would be education, transportation, and what did I say? Education, transportation, and healthcare. So that's where I went and I called the companies, I did the research, and I asked, what is the price? What is the cost? How much does it, what type of car would a person who works as a healthcare professional, if they come in there, what's the typical type of car they buy? I call the sales agents. I said, I'm a researcher. They said, well, usually if somebody's coming in and they are this type of job or that type of job, they're probably going to end up getting one of these 2 cars. So I said, well, can you send me the price quotes? So they sent me, I called 3 car companies in Nassau and 2 new car companies in Freeport. Got the quotes. I did the same thing with the, I found out, I called companies that did completed service jobs. How much does a service job cost? How much does an oil change cost? Tire repairs, how much does that cost? Because every 40,000 miles, these things are standardized. I found out what gas rate was at the time, calculated how much gas you needed per mile, etc. All of that was figured into the monthly calculation that I got per the methodology with transportation. And the same thing with education. I got the quotes for 3 or 4 schools in New Providence, private schools, one of the major religious schools. I asked them, can you please send me your school tuition rates? I got the tuition rate straight from kindergarten to 12th grade. I calculated additional costs, that would be whatever their seat fees were, and then, additional expenses, those $25 fun day letters that come home now. My son sends now, brings home the $25 per day.
I know, right? I can relate. I'm like, they charging y'all all of this to dress up. I understand.
I listen. So I did that on the rate for to educate 2 children in private school from kindergarten to grade 12 was anywhere between 104 and 6. So let's say 105,000 to 156,000 if you're one of the private Christian schools, between 104 and 155, 105 and $155,000 from kindergarten to grade 12, and that's not including inflation. So you would have to consider that. That's also not, that did not include, tuition goes up every few years. I didn't include their 2 year or every 3 year tuition rate. So that has to be moved along as well. This was kind of like a static um, middle income cost of living rate, because I attempted to capture what was happening in the environment at the time, and inflation is a moving rate and tuitions move. So that came down. So the average family is paying, if they have 2 kids, around $742 a month for school. over the course of the 12 months. I mean, the 13 years. So from kindergarten straight to grade 12, an average of $742 a month, right? Because kindergarten costs less than, primary school, that costs less than high school. And I had to weigh the averages of all of those. And the same thing with healthcare. I called a few companies. And of course, this again was highly subjective. I said, well, I'm a researcher. Maybe can you give me the cost of a family of four, and maybe in their 30s, the woman in her 30s, the husband in his 40s, they have two young kids. What would insurance look like for this family? Can you send me some quotes, please? So I got a quotes from a few companies. I tacked on to that possible co-pays, medicinal fees, or the cost of, if you're just getting the basic insurance and you don't have prescription insurance. So that tacked on. So it's an average, I put around $900 a month. So that would depend. That was with the major insurance companies that are out there. I tried to get the lowest rates and then tack on the additional expenses to do with it, to associate it with it. And what I found out was that the numbers some of them were far off. For example, remember, like I said, I went to the survey first and I got the percentage. I worked out the percentage. So let's do this. The percentage was for transportation worked out to be for decile 6 worked out to be $1,009 according to the secondary information. Now, when I did the post check, that's what it's called. When I called the car companies, I did the post check and it was $742. But that's $740 per car. And we know in the Bahamas, so again, I was very conscious that the public transportation isn't as flexible as most persons need. And so I had to put in two cars. So my total was $1,698. So while the survey says it should be around $1,000, I found that it was around $1,700 because I took in consideration the two cars. So I subtracted it and I got a difference of around $700. I used that $700 to add to what the secondary data said. I said, okay, the secondary data's estimate of $2,600 needs to add the $700 for the extra car, because we are in the Bahamas, most households have two vehicles, and the same thing with transportation, and the same thing with education. The preliminary estimate was around $250 for two kids. However, I'm assuming that was also with they use the public education system, because my estimate when I called the schools was around $742, right? So that was around $500 difference. So I tacked on additional 700, then I tacked on an additional 500 to the secondary information, and then for healthcare, the government statistics show that a family of four would only spend on average $7 a month on healthcare. But my post check showed that they would spend about $900 if they had health insurance, private health insurance. So I had to tack on that additional amount. And when I took the secondary finding that said an average decile 6 family will spend around, well, they said $2,589. So let's say $2,600. They said an average family spends $2,600. But I found that there was an additional $2,000 shortage. I'm like, okay, we need to add this. After I actually went into the field and found out there's an additional $2,000 not being accounted for in the survey results. And I added that, and that's how it came to $4,500 for the non-food, non-housing costs. I hope that was clear. In New Providence, and then $4,000 in Grand Bahama. And again, they had the statistics for Grand Bahama that I converted, called the companies, did the math, and that's how I got $4,000.
Yeah, that was pretty straightforward. I appreciate that. It's very, you're putting a lot of things in perspective. So we've gone through 3 of the 4 major categories. We've gone through food, which is estimated at $1,400 a month if buying in bulk for 4 people. We've gone through housing, which is
and eating basic, not
and not
and
eating out, not
yeah.
eating lavishly and not eating out. We've gone
Right.
through housing as well. There's also been transportation, and then there's the non-food, sorry, not transportation, my apologies. Let me clarify. Food is one category, housing is the second, non-food, non-housing, which encompasses education, healthcare, and transportation, What is the fourth and final category, Lesvie?
The fourth and final category is savings. Money for additional provision, savings, emergencies, investments. That category is what was tacked on to the cost of living. And according to the Central Bank of the Bahamas, they recommend that Bahamians save on average at least 15% of their salary. So, with the first three categories, the food, the housing, and then the non food, non housing costs, that totaled around, that was what, $7,900. So I found out what 15% of $7,900 was. And that came to be around $1,200 a month. So if you are living this lifestyle where you are, let's say you're living in Cable Beach, or let's say all of your rental costs are around $200, your food bill is around $1,400, your additional expenses around $3,400 a month, you should be saving at least $1,200 a month. As for savings, emergencies, investments, and sustainability, at least $1,200 a month um, to to maintain this middle class lifestyle that is constructed for this study.
Leslie, I have a question based on the deciles and this housing expenditure survey. Does it indicate what percentage of the population fits into each decile?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Well,
I'll have to check. I don't know.
okay. I think that'll be interesting because I think a lot of times, so and you indicated there are 10 levels of this, 10 deciles. 1 and 2 you
Right.
put at the poverty line. 3 would have been minimum wage. So I'm thinking 4 and 5 is living wage. 6 is your middle class, right? How would you categorize then 7, 8, 9, and 10?
So I would say 7 and 8 would be upper middle class, and
Mhm.
then 9 and 10 would be upper class,
Upper class or the wealthy?
the wealthy. Yeah.
So Leslie, $1,200 for savings. Let me go back to where we was, right? Because you said $1,400 for food, $2,000 for housing, $4,500 for non-housing, non-food, and $1,200 for saving. You also said a word earlier that I don't think we consider a lot, and that is inflation. Um, why is it that people are not factoring in inflation into their cost of living?
I think because people are too busy living and struggling and surviving. That's the first reason. The second reason, I think, because we are that sometimes there's feel that there's a loss of control. I can't do anything about it, or I don't feel like I can do anything about it. So those two and then the third thing is not knowing. So you don't know really. You're told to pay a price and you pay it. So between survival, a loss of control, and ignorance, I think that affects how we respond to the inflation that we're currently facing in this country. Most of
Les
us.
Leslie, it is said that around the world, globally, that the middle class is shrinking, that we are seeing, particularly when you look at the housing market in the United States, and I think there are quite a number of homes here, even up for foreclosure. If contact any of the banks for their foreclosure list, it's a long list. And I always say to people, I said, well, I didn't know that banks were in the real estate industry because they got more properties listed than the real estate agents do, right? And I remember years ago when I think it was about 2014, thereabout, Barack Obama was in giving a State of the Union address, and he used a term that I've never forgotten, and he spoke about the working class poor. Are we seeing that working class poor increase and the middle class decreasing here, or is that not a Bahamian reality?
Oh no, no, no. Very, very much. I think we have one of the highest income disparities in the region. Actually, that has been a well-established fact for many, 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 many years. There's a big, big gap because the middle class would kind of be that balance, but that balance is shrinking, and there is a substantial difference now. The persons who are very wealthy versus those who are barely getting by. There's hardly anything in between. So the research says, so it is shrinking. And that thing about housing, again, there's a mindset that we have to have home ownership, but home ownership comes with so much additional expenses versus renting a home. But to rent is almost to be inadequate. To be in your 50s and 60s and renting is not considered, culturally appropriate in the Western world, or in many parts of the Western world, or in many parts of the Caribbean, if we want to get post colonial with it. Um, and so that additional burden, as well, of having to maintain this ideology that home ownership is best, is something that affects how much we pay and how we live.
Listen, Leslie, I don't think a lot of people realize, but a lot of renters, you look at people and you'd be like, well, how come they could do this and I can't do this? And you kind of compare. It's almost natural to do that, right? But what people don't realize is that a lot of renters have more disposable income than homeowners because they're not having to pay real property tax. They're not having to pay homeowners insurance. They're not having to take out life insurance for the value of that mortgage. And these are costs that I didn't even hear you mention because you were focused on your housing costs was for rental. You said you did an estimate of 50 rentals. And like you said, our reality here is that a lot of our middle class are homeowners, and that too has an impact. So I think what I'm realizing is that we have to really begin to look at things from what makes sense versus what the status quo calls for or what the status quo has been maintaining for quite a number of years. Leslie, we're almost out of time. What do you hope people will take away from the results of this survey? And what do you want this survey to, what thought process do you want this survey to trigger for people in the minds of Bahamians?
I want it to help people to wake up and, first of all, to feel that they're not alone. If you are struggling financially, based upon what I've shown you, you can gauge that this right here, that what I've presented is the reality of many persons in this country. And I don't have an empirical number right now to give you how many Bahamians rent in and have their kids in school, but just feel that you're not alone. But also look at it as a guide. If your children are in private school, you should be at least put in $1,200 aside, or it's something that you could work forward to. I'm hoping that it demystifies and stops. Some people are scared to delve into finances. They're scared to look at finances and they're afraid to attempt to understand it. So I'm hoping just, the little table that's going to come out in the journal in October, just post up the table and it just gives some kind of guidance or guidelines, and you could determine how to adjust from there, and seeing yourself as one of a whole, that this is the life of many of us here in the Bahamas. And so you can move forward. So I hope it's a form of empowerment, knowledge and education and empowerment for my fellow Bahamians and also for foreigners coming down. The University of the Bahamas, our mandate is to, on our strategic plan, is to increase the number of international, one of them to increase the number of international faculty that we have. Maybe this is something that if we have international persons considering coming down, faculty can look at it as a guide, international faculty, when they're coming down, so they can plan for their lifestyles and they can plan for their family, as well as even students come in, if they're married students or maybe for our graduate programs, they can plan their life and their resources when they come down here as well. Even culturally, if we decide to have some, how Barbados has a virtual visa, persons coming down, they pay for a visa to just live in the country while they work their remote jobs. At least now this is some guidance. Okay, this is what I can expect to pay or how much I need to budget to live. So maybe it can even help our country's tourism product in that way, or operate as a starting point, for growth, for economic growth and organization.
Lesvie, thank you so much for sharing this information. Thank you for taking on the task of conducting this research. It has been very enlightening. And I hope that all of our listeners are able to walk away a little bit more empowered, that they can begin to think and rethink about what they can do in their lives to have a more sustainable future, looking at the cost of living in our country, looking at inflation, looking at their income, and making some wise decisions so that they are in a better position and that they don't find themselves one paycheck away from moving down into another class, moving down the ladder rather than up the ladder. I would want us to be moving up the decile ladder, not down. Lesvie, again, thank you very much. And to my listening audience, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of University Drive. So whether you're, considering where you are on that decile, whether you're saving enough, not saving enough, whether you're expending too much in one category and you should be cutting back and figuring it all out, right? It's never too late to start. That's my point. It's never too late to start. So get started and make some wise choices. For this podcast and for more UB information, be sure to visit our website at www.ub.edu.bs and be sure to follow us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And join us next week, same time, same radio station, for another exciting edition of University Drive. I'm Nikki Bowe. Enjoy the remainder of your day.
University Drive is a production of the Office of University Relations and the Communications and Creative Arts Academic Unit at University of the Bahamas. All rights reserved.